Reason may be defined as the notion of drawing plausible conclusions through means of coherent and logical thinking. It is a way of knowing in which we construct meanings together, thus spawning the necessary facts and information for the obtainment of valid and justified truths. At times, however, our senses of vindicate reasoning and rationalization may be swept away by the rivers of beliefs and conceptions that heavily dominate and surge through us. Thus, fallacies are created, which, as emphasized in the reading packet, are arguments or conclusions which break the laws of logical proof. Whether what we believe can be justified through logical considerations is a matter that may be forcefully overridden by the firmness of faith in the nature of our social surroundings. Since the time of the Enlightenment, reason has assumed a huge role for building up plausible theories. Assembling empirical or propositional evidence and assessing its deductive or inductive support for one's beliefs had become an unwritten rule in society. Nonetheless, while our belief in something like evolution lives symbiotically with reasoning and logic provided by scientific explanations, we can never be sure of the validity of those explanations. Take the example of the great misconceptions at the time of Galileo. People firmly believed that our Earth was flat and at the center of the universe. Their reasoning at the time was perfectly rational, and those like Copernicus or Galileo, in refusal of those theories, were persecuted in society. The reason for that may have been attributed to society's heavy religious constraints. The Church had predominantly dictated the conception of the world at the time and the belief of an omnipotent God, having verified the notion of his creation, planet Earth, being at the center of the universe. One wouldn't want to accept the idea of God not putting the Earth as the central element of his creation. Similarly, through use of perception for knowledge, people at the time naturally assumed that the sun must have been going around the Earth. They couldn't exactly feel the Earth rotating beneath them, in the same way as they couldn't logically fathom a spherical Earth with upside-down people on the opposite side of them. We could say that the people of the time had beliefs that were logically justifiable, and in this way we can grasp the fact that logic and reason itself isn't absolute, but relative to its socio-historic environment. What we know today may be disproven in the future, and while we're here, the logic that coincides with our belief is the one we accept. An alternative paradigm, where faulty reasoning is chiefly accepted on the basis of beliefs, may be seen in totalitarian systems of government in certain cultures. Controlled media, heavy propaganda projected onto the people of North Korea had affected in the deficiency of knowledge of the truth. People live in a bubble of unawareness, isolated from the rest of the world, with a disability to grasp the malice and brutality of their dictator. Having lived in a country under totalitarian rule, Jennet can deeply relate to this. For instance, her impression of the Turkmen dictator was for the most part a highly positive one. His severe personality cult had generated belief of him being a highly regarded, courageous man, who deserves to be praised and glorified for all he had done for his country. Hence, Jennet's logic and reasoning had been heavily barred and inhibited from formulating valid beliefs and ideas. With the example of Hitler, we can also see how beliefs tend to cloud our judgments and affect our capacity to reason with logic. Under Hitler's rule, a majority of people had assumed the belief of anti-Semitism and the notion of ethnic cleansing, despite its complete illogical basis. People were heavily swayed by the power of propaganda, forming their beliefs, to recognize the faulty rationalization and the general horror of Hitler's intentions. Religion may perhaps be accredited to being the paramount example that goes to illustrate the conflicting relationship of reason and belief. Belief in God, or some form of transcendent being of omnipotent abilities, has been assumed in virtually every culture throughout human history. Similarly, those who don't believe and don't assume any religious belief generate a clash of theism and atheism, fundamentally a conflict of reason and faith. The reasoning behind the belief in God varies greatly from person to person. Some accept the notion of an omnipotent, all-knowing God on the basis of their own religious experiences, while others claim the belief to be invalid as there is lack of evidence to verify it. In earlier times, people firmly believed that diseases were triggered as a punishment from God for their personal sins or shortcomings. They had failed to reason logically about the true root and origin of their illness. When Europe was struck by the plague in the 1300s, people were in dispute over a logical explanation that accounted for the coming of the disease. One theory was that evil spirits had entered the bodies of the victims. The solution to this problem? Stabbing of the arm until enough demon-contaminated blood has been released. For rather obvious reasons, this failed to serve as a sufficient remedy to cure the pandemic, which continued to spread until a third of Europe's population had been wiped out. In fact, a vast number of individuals stabbed themselves to death. Those who survived the horrific self-endured pain grew weaker and thus became more vulnerable to the disease. Due to scientific advancements, we now know that the most severe manifestation of disease that Europe has ever encountered was caused by the Yersinia pestis bacteria. But due to pure desperation, the European population struggled to find an adequate justification, and thus irrational explanations flourished and were eventually adapted by the people. Belief may at times decrease our capacity to reason logically. However, it is also evident that one cannot always be sure that our reasoning is correct in the first place. To the people of earlier times, the reasoning and the knowledge they had was undoubtedly correct. Similarly, modern-day beliefs and knowledge claims may appear to be accurate. But as we are unaware of what the future will bring, we can never be too sure of the validity of our own knowledge. Imagine in the future, there may be historical artifacts in our era, criticizing our faulty reasoning and beliefs. Perhaps the earth is flat after all.